All right, let's get right into it. For years, the DayZ community has pretty much run on a mix of experience, a lot of guesswork, and a fair bit of myth. Well, the Safe House project was created to change all that. Its mission is to build the one single, definitive, evidence-based reference for the world of DayZ. I mean, documenting how the game actually produces outcomes, from the engine tick all the way to what we see as a player. And this quote, this is the core principle right here. The whole project is built on this idea of replacing community myths with verifiable facts. It's about getting past the solutions that just feel right and figuring out what is proven to be right through really deep system-first analysis. So to really get how they do this, we're going to walk through 6 key areas. First, we'll look at the mission to replace that folklore with fact. Then we'll explore the World Atlas itself, dive deep into their standard of evidence, which is huge, look at the custom tools they're building, understand their data layer, and then wrap it up with the project's ultimate goal. So what's the fundamental problem that Safe House is trying to solve? It's really that gap between what players think they know about DayZ and what can actually be proven about how it works. This really just illustrates the whole difference perfectly. On one side, you have community folklore. You know the stuff. It's knowledge that's based on experience or what everyone agrees on, but it's never been formally measured or verified. On the other side, you have the Safe House standard. Here, every single claim has to be backed by documented, observed, and empirical evidence. It's a complete shift from collective belief to verifiable truth. And you know, this isn't just some academic exercise. Safe House is a group of incredibly experienced players and analysts. It was founded by Bird, a player with something like 10,000 hours in the game. Their focus is completely system-first, which means they want to understand the absolute truth of the Infusion engine to master the game's mechanics from the ground up. And the main results of all this work? It's a single, massive document, the DayZ World Atlas. It's designed to be the ultimate authority on how this game really ticks. And the scope of this thing is just huge. The Atlas is broken down into 12 domains that cover the entire server simulation. So we're not just talking about one piece of the puzzle, like loot or combat. No, it's about understanding the core engine, the AI behavior, and crucially, how all these complex systems actually talk to each other to create the DayZ we experience. Now, what I find really interesting here is the project's honesty. The Atlas is a living, breathing document. This chart shows you the maturity of different domains. You can see the central loot economy and scripting are really well documented. But then look at environment. It's still at 0. They're completely transparent about where the map is filled in and where they're still sketching out the details. Okay, let's get into what I think is the most critical part of this whole project, the strict methodology they use. This is what ensures every claim is trustworthy. This is where Safe House really sets itself apart. So every single claim in the Atlas has an evidence tag. This system doesn't rate how confident the author is, it rates the quality of the evidence behind the claim. A documented tag, that means it's verified directly from the source code. On the other end of the spectrum, you have folklore. That tag means it's a community claim that's just treated as input. It's not evidence until it can be rigorously tested and verified. So, what is this proto-boundary? Just think of it like a wall. On our side of the wall, that's the game logic we can actually see and analyze in the enforce script. But on the other side, that's the hidden core C++ engine code. We can't see what's happening over there directly. This means any claim about what happens behind the wall has a hard limit on how confident we can be. And Safe House is incredibly disciplined about acknowledging exactly where that wall is. This makes it really concrete. Let's take projectile simulation. From the script side, you can observe things like initial speed and air friction, but the internal flight path calculation, the physics tick rate, that's all hidden in the engine. Same thing with car physics. You can see the inputs and the outputs, but the internal simulation is a total black box. The Atlas makes it a point to document exactly what can and cannot be known. You know, just analyzing code can only get you so far, especially with that proto-boundary in the way. So to push past those limits, Safe House doesn't just analyze the game, they build their own tools to actually measure it. This is basically their scientific method. When they find a gap in their knowledge, they build a specific, purpose-built diagnostic mod. And this mod isn't a feature for us players, it's a scientific instrument. They use it to directly measure engine behavior under controlled conditions. This generates new, high-quality observed data, which then gets fed right back into the Atlas. It's all about measurement, not speculation.
And they've built a whole suite of these instruments. You've got tools like CE-Calteet that passively monitor the loot economy. There's AI Explorer, which is an autonomous bot used to gather data without messing with the server logic. And this all happens on the Roost, a dedicated vanilla test server that gives them a totally controlled environment for their experiments.
Okay, so all this verified data needs a place to live, right? The project's infrastructure is designed to make sure that the raw facts and the analysis are always perfectly in sync. The whole foundation is a private GitHub repository. This is the project's fact layer. It's got the raw vanilla source files and the code from community mods. Now, this isn't the Atlas itself, but the two have to evolve together. The repo gives them the verified technical facts, the what, and the Atlas provides the framework that explains it all, the why it matters. So what does this all build towards? I mean, what is the ultimate purpose of this incredibly rigorous systematic effort? It all comes down to this single powerful idea. The goal is for the empirical, verifiable, and rigorously tested data inside the Atlas to become the final authority on how DAISY works. It's meant to supersede any community consensus, any folklore, any guesswork. It's about creating a single, undeniable source of truth. And when you really step back and look at it, it becomes so clear. In a simulation as deep and as complex as the N-Fusion engine, with all its interacting systems and a decade of changes, this level of rigor isn't just some academic thing, it's absolutely essential. And it kind of leaves us with the question, in a world this complex, how else can truth really be found? Welcome to This Explainer. We're about to go deep, really deep, into the digital trenches. We're going to dissect the rigorous, almost forensic process Safehouse uses to pull factual truth out of DAISY's notoriously opaque engine. Okay, so here's the game plan. First, we'll tackle the big problem they're trying to solve. Then we'll get into their system for evidence, the tools they actually build to get that evidence, and a really cool case study. After that, we'll talk about the mindset you need for this work and wrap up with what they consider the final word on what's true. So to really get what Safehouse does, you have to understand the problem they're up against. And it's a big one. This massive, tangled web of community assumptions, what they call folklore. Now let's be super clear here. When we say folklore, we're not calling it fake or wrong. Think of it more as unverified community knowledge. You know, all that wisdom that comes from millions of hours of gameplay. It's a fantastic place to start an investigation, for sure, but it's never, ever the final answer. And this right here, this is the whole philosophy in a nutshell. These widely held beliefs, they're treated like tips, like leads you'd investigate. You don't just accept them as fact. That's the huge difference between a rumor and a verified report, right? Okay, check this out. A perfect example of this is the on-update myth. For years, I mean years, the community wisdom, the folklore, was that this key game function ticked along at about 60 times a second. Makes sense, right? But when they actually measured it, whoa. On an idle server, it fires closer to 17,000 times a second. That massive gap between what we think is happening and what's really happening, that's exactly why this method is so crucial. So, the big question is, how do you fight against all this folklore and, just as importantly, your own biases? Well, Safehouse does it with something called the evidence rubric. It's a super disciplined, totally transparent system, and honestly, it's the beating heart of their entire approach. And the system is built on one simple but really powerful idea. The only thing that matters is the quality of your evidence, not how confident you feel, not your reputation, none of that. It completely strips away ego, opinion, and all those, well, I'm pretty sure moments. The data just speaks for itself. All right, and these are the 8 tags that make up the core of the rubric. Think of it like a ladder of truth, you know? It creates a super clear and honest hierarchy. Right at the top, you've got documented. That's the gold standard, verified directly from official files. Then you've got stuff in the middle, like observed or corroborated. And way down at the bottom, you find folklore and ambiguous. And that's key. Sometimes just knowing that we don't know for sure is the most important finding of all. And here's something that really shows you how rigorous this whole thing is. Proving something isn't there is just as important as proving something is. If you do a full audit of a source file and parameter is just gone, that's not a dead end. That's a documented finding. And man, does that save a ton of time chasing ghosts in the machine. But look, to get this kind of high-quality evidence, you can't just sit around reading config files. Nope, you've got to get your hands dirty. You have to literally build your own tools to go in and poke around the engine's hidden inner workings.
And the reason you have to build these special tools comes down to this thing called the proto-boundary. The best way to picture it is like an invisible wall. On our side, you've got the game logic, the enforced script. We can see that, we can read it. But on the other side of that wall, that's the native Infusion engine, and it's a total black box. No one gets to look inside. So the mods Safehouse builds, they're not for playing the game. Not at all. Think of them as sterile, surgical instruments. They call them software probes, and they have one job, and one job only. Send a very specific signal across that boundary and then carefully, meticulously measure what comes back. Now, how do you make sure your own biases don't sneak into the tools you're building? It's a huge risk. Well, they have a rule for that, the 3-mirror minimum review. Every single instrument, before it gets deployed, has its code validated by at least 3 different AI platforms. This is all to prevent something called cascade bias, where one tiny error at the start snowballs into a massive problem later. It's a critical safety check. Okay, so we've got the rubric, we've got these custom software probes, we've got this intense discipline, but what does it all look like in practice? Let's walk through a real-world case study. The hunt for what seems like a simple number. How much health does a player's head actually have? The hunt for head HP is just a perfect and really honest look at how messy this work can be. It started out as simple folklore, the community thought it was around 60, then, boom, they get a decompiled source file and it gives them a documented answer, 100 HP. Great, case closed, right? Nope, they cross-validate with another source file, and it says 33, a totally different but equally documented number. So what do? The method forces you to be honest. They had to downgrade their own finding and admit, hey, we don't have the final answer yet. And this case just nails the core philosophy, doesn't it? You have to trace the mechanism, not just the player experience. Because what you see in-game, or even what you find in your first pass of the data, can be super misleading. The real truth is buried in the machinery of the code itself, not in the shadows it throws on the wall. This kind of discipline, this willingness to self-correct, it's not an accident. It's actually baked into their final guiding principle. It's a culture of extreme, you might even say obsessive diligence, that they call the zero mistakes principle. Here's a fantastic example of that principle in action. You never trust a function or variable's name to tell you what it does. I mean, look at stamina weight limit threshold. It sounds exactly like a weight limit in kilograms, right? But when you actually trace the math in the code, turns out it's a unitless number that's just one part of a much more complex formula. The lesson is simple. You don't guess what the units are, you prove it. And this whole principle is held up by a few simple, totally non-negotiable rules. Anytime you see an absolute word, like never or always, that's a red flag that requires a full audit. You verify every single unit. And maybe most importantly, you learn to love the gaps. Seeing an ambiguous tag isn't a failure. It's an honest statement that says, this is the edge of what we currently know for sure. So, after all of this, after the rubric, the probes, the relentless testing and retesting, what's left? What is the final authority on truth in this incredibly complex digital world? So who gets the final say? Is it the community consensus, what thousands of people believe from their experience? Is it a powerful AI's opinion after crunching all the numbers? Or is it some comment a developer dropped in a forum post back in 2019? Well, the answer is pretty clear. It's none of those. The only authority that matters, the only final arbiter, is the hard, cold data from a clean, repeatable, instrumented test. That's it. Community consensus and folklore, that's where the questions begin. But the measurement, that's where the argument ends. Safehouse doesn't guess, they measure. And in this world of digital smoke and mirrors, that commitment to provable empirical fact, well, that's everything.
Let's begin. This isn't just an explanation, it's a briefing on the architecture of a system. It's a system designed not to interpret truth, but to establish it. One that systematically replaces folklore with fact, and all speculation with hard measurement.
So here's our operational roadmap, broken down into 6 key sections. We're going to start with the foundation of our knowledge, then define the main obstacle we're up against. After that, we'll get into the methodology and the tools we built to overcome it, see how they all work together in a self-reinforcing loop, and finally, we'll cover the core doctrine that drives this entire operation.
Okay, Section 1, the Atlas of Truth. You can think of this as the structural spine of the whole ecosystem. It's the project's brain, the single canonical repository for every last piece of verified information we have.
Now, the DayZ World Atlas isn't some player's guide you'd find online. Not at all.
It's a systems-first knowledge base. See, the whole idea is that to really truly understand DayZ, you can't just skim the surface. You have to document precisely how the game produces outcomes. This thing spans 12 distinct domains, everything from the Infusion engine itself to the loot economy, survival mechanics, and the scripting that glues it all together. It is, for all intents and purposes, the definitive map of the machine.
The integrity of the Atlas is held up by one single, uncompromising principle. We call it the grounding rule. No claim, and I mean no piece of data, gets into this knowledge base without being explicitly tagged. And this isn't about how confident an author feels, it's about systemic discipline. It forces a kind of structural honesty about what we actually know, and just as important, how we know it.
The real precision of this whole system is just how objective it is. The tags, you see, they describe the quality of the evidence itself, not anyone's personal belief. So, a documented tag? That means the claim is 100% verified from official source files or direct code inspection. Observed means it came from our own instrumented measurements or some really controlled testing. Then, way down at the other end of the spectrum, you've got things like ambiguous, where the evidence conflicts, and folklore, which is basically just community-sourced claims that are waiting to be verified. This hierarchy is what ensures that as the Atlas gets bigger, its rigor only increases.
Look, community knowledge is valuable, for sure, but it enters our system as an input, something to be investigated, not as a conclusion we've already reached. You could say folklore is a question, not an answer. It has to be rigorously evaluated against primary, verifiable evidence. This rubric, this is what separates real, verified knowledge from simple myth.
Right. On to Section 2, the proto-boundary barrier. Every intelligence gathering operation has an antagonist, right? Well, for us, it's not a person or a group. It's an architectural wall. It is the single core obstacle to finding absolute truth.
So, the DayZ simulation runs on what you'd call a hybrid architecture. On one side, you've got EnforceScript. This is all the game logic the developers decided to expose to the world. It's observable, you can trace it, you can even modify it. But on the other side is the Infusion C++ engine. Now this is native code. Its internal logic is completely opaque. It's a black box that handles all the heavy lifting, physics, networking, persistence, you name it.
We call that line between these two worlds the proto-boundary. It's the exact point where a diagnostic trace, digging through the script files, hits what's called a proto-native function. That's a function that's declared in the script, but its actual implementation is buried deep inside the C++ engine. And at that point, static analysis just stops, cold. It hits an impenetrable architectural wall.
The proto-boundary creates a hard ceiling on our confidence for any claim made about what's behind it. It doesn't matter how much you infer, it doesn't matter how much you observe from the script side. You can never definitively confirm how the engine's internal C++ code is actually working. We can see what goes in and we can see what comes out, but the mechanism itself remains a total black box. And the Atlas is built to acknowledge this limitation with absolute honesty.
Which brings us to Section 3, a new methodology. The very existence of the proto-boundary dictates how we have to respond. If we can't see inside the black box, we will not guess. We will invent a new way of knowing. This is the critical shift from guesswork to measurement.
This, right here, is the core operational philosophy. When our analysis hits that boundary, all inference ends and instrumentation begins. The discipline is to fight that temptation to just speculate about what the engine's doing. Instead, we design an experiment to measure its external behavior with precision.
We call this methodology observability and instrumentation. And really, it's a form of applied science. We treat that observable and force script layer not just as game logic, but as an operational surface. It's a launchpad, a place from which we can deploy our own custom-built software probes. These are in-process agents, implemented as game mods, designed to measure the black box engine's behavior from inside the live simulation.
And we don't just start building these things on a whim. Before a single line of code is ever written for an instrument, we run it through an intelligence-grade validation process. Research is sent out to multiple independent AI agents. Their findings are then slammed together in a convergence analysis. We're looking for any conflicts, and those are rigorously resolved. This adversarial review is designed to kill confirmation bias and make absolutely sure our instruments are built to measure reality, not just to confirm a hypothesis we already had.
Okay, Section 4. The diagnostic arsenal. This methodology demands a completely new class of tool. These aren't mods you build for gameplay. They are scientific instruments purpose-built to do one thing: generate evidence.
These are the tools of our new science.
First up is the Central Economy Calibration Tool, or CCALT. Its job is pure passive observation. It hooks directly into the engine's callbacks for item creation and deletion, so it can monitor the complete life cycle of every single object managed by the game's economy. It watches, it records, but it never, ever interferes. It's all about establishing the baseline reality.
Next, we have the AI Explorer. This is a fully autonomous server-side bot. By creating a measurement tool that acts just like a player, we get full access to all the player's simulation systems. It moves through the world under our scripted direction, acting as a mobile sensor platform. It collects performance telemetry and environmental data in a controlled, repeatable way that a human player just can't. But the primary instrument, the real heavy hitter, is the Safehouse Probe. This is a unified platform that combines that passive observation with autonomous execution. Its key capability, though, is active stimulus injection. It's designed specifically to reach across the proto-boundary, to call those native functions with very controlled inputs, and then precisely measure the outputs. It doesn't just observe the black box, it interrogates it, forcing the engine to reveal its exact transfer functions.
Now for Section 5, the flywheel of truth. These three pillars we've talked about, the knowledge base, the methodology, and the tools, they aren't independent. They're designed to feed each other. They create a self-improving, perpetual engine for generating knowledge.
The cycle itself is incredibly simple but powerful. First, the Atlas identifies a knowledge gap. A question that's been tagged as ambiguous or just folklore. Second, the right diagnostic tool is deployed to run a controlled experiment. Third, that live execution generates proven empirical data. And finally, that data, now carrying our highest evidence tag, instrument tested, is integrated right back into the Atlas, closing the gap. The knowledge base tells our instruments what to test, and the instruments tell our knowledge base what is true. It's a perfect loop.
And that brings us to our final section. Section 6, the Safehouse Doctrine. This whole ecosystem, this entire architecture of truth, it's all governed by a single core identity. It's the fundamental ethos of the entire operation.
This is the mission. We are not here to guess or to assume or to just repeat conventional wisdom. We're here to determine, from the engine C++ core all the way out, precisely how this simulation functions. We are seeking absolute truth, based on proven, instrument-tested fact. Everything else is simply discarded.
This explainer has detailed one such architecture, an entire ecosystem of knowledge, discipline, and instrumentation, all designed to answer a single fundamental challenge. And it leaves us with a critical question, one I'll leave with you. When the truth you're after is locked away inside an opaque, inaccessible system, what tools must you be willing to build to find it?
All right, let's get straight to it. We're here to talk about the diagnostic arsenal, and I want to be crystal clear from the start. These are not mods in the way you might think. These are surgical instruments. Their entire purpose isn't to add new guns or cool features. No, it's to dissect the DayZ engine itself, to pull out hard empirical truth through pure systematic measurement.
So this really gets to the heart of our philosophy. Think of the DayZ engine as a total black box, right? It's all compiled C++ code, and we just can't get inside. But it has a script layer, and that script layer, that's our way in. It's the surface where we can insert our probes. So if we want to figure out what's really going on inside that box, we don't build mods for fun. We build instruments. We build them for one reason, to measure.
This means we have to completely redefine what a mod even is, at least for our purposes. We're not building gameplay additions. What we're actually deploying are, well, the technical term is in-process application performance management agents. It's a mouthful, I know. But what it really means is we're creating software probes that run inside the game's own environment. These are, for all intents and purposes, our scientific instruments.
Okay, so here's the plan for today. We're going to walk through how these tools evolved. We'll start with the basic idea, then look at our first tool, CECALT, which is all about passive observation, just listening. Then we'll get into the AI Explorer, which adds autonomous sensing. After that, we'll see how Safehouse Probe takes both of those and starts actively interrogating the engine. And to wrap it all up, we'll see how we use this whole arsenal to simulate the most hostile environment imaginable, a full server on the brink.
So we're redefining the mod. It all comes down to a very simple, very firm philosophy. We replace community folklore with hard, empirical data. No more, I think, or it feels like. Every single tool we're about to cover was built for one reason and one reason only: to measure.
All right, let's dive into the first instrument in the toolkit, CCALT.
That stands for Central Economy Calibration Tool. The best way to think about this one, it's our stethoscope. It's a completely passive tool. Its only job is to press up against the central economy and just listen. It logs the entire life cycle of every single item from birth to death without ever interfering.
So how does it do this? Well, it works in 3 stages. First, birth. It hooks directly into the engine's E-on-C create event. The moment an item is born into the world, bam, we log its complete initial state. Next up is the census. While the item is alive, we're periodically polling it, taking snapshots of its data. And finally, death. We hook into E-delete, so we capture the item's final terminal state right at the moment it's removed. Birth, life, death. We get the whole story, a complete data set for every single object.
And you know, just by listening, we uncovered something absolutely critical. The common wisdom was that the central economy just kind of waits for items to time out. But that's not what the data showed. Not at all. Yeah, about 78% of deletions happen because of natural expiry. But a full 21.4%, that's something else. We call it an active CE purge. This means the engine is a proactive manager. It's actively going out and deleting items to manage the service population, not just cleaning up messes.
And all of this data, it all pointed to one number. Honestly, this is probably the single most operationally significant finding to ever come out of this instrument. A number that completely changes how you have to think about item persistence in DayZ. That number? 1,800 seconds.
So what does that mean? It means this, the 1,800 second convergence. We found that a staggering 82.7% of all newly spawned items are what we call born dormant. And for these items, the engine basically ignores whatever lifetime the server admin has set. It just despawns them in about 30 minutes, 1,800 seconds. So that 8-hour lifetime you so carefully configured in your server files? Yeah, for the vast majority of items, it's completely irrelevant. The engine just overrides it and poof, the item is gone.
So passive listening is great. It gives us a baseline. But what if we need to take measurements in a specific place without a human player sitting there for hours? That's where the next tool comes in, the AI Explorer. Now, don't think of this as some kind of combat NPC. It's not. It's an autonomous, instrumented bot, a mobile sensor platform we can send out on missions to collect data completely on its own.
Okay, to really get why the Explorer is such a game changer, you have to understand a key concept in the engine, the player identity. This is super important. The player identity is not the player's character model. It's the session object the engine creates when a real, human player connects over the network. And the crucial part? You can't create one from script. It's impossible. It is the engine's one, true, verifiable proof that a real person is connected.
And how we built this bot is what makes it a precision instrument. We made very specific engineering choices. For entity creation, we use createObject, which means it never touches the player database. It inherits from playerbase, which gives it full access to all the player systems we need to measure. Stats, inventory, all that. And for movement, we just use setPosition. It's instant, it's deterministic, it's teleportation. Every single one of these decisions was made to make sure it acts as a pure measurement probe, not as some clunky simulated player.
This all led to one critical question, the whole reason for the experiment. The bot is in the world. It looks like a player. It acts kinda like one. But from the central economy's point of view, does it even exist? Can the CE's spatial logic actually see it?
And the answer, we found, was a resounding no. This was the Explorer's biggest discovery. The central economy's logic, things like the avoid player flag that prevents loot from spawning too close to you, it doesn't care about simple entity presence. It doesn't care that there's a player base object standing there. It only cares about an authenticated session, that player identity we talked about. Our bot doesn't have one. And the result? Our probe is completely invisible to the very systems it's designed to measure.
Now, think about that for a second. Having an invisible bot is a massive, massive advantage. It's like having a scientist in a clean room. So the next logical step was to combine our tools. We took the passive listening capability of ccCalt and merged it with the autonomous, invisible action of the AI Explorer. The result is the next evolution of the arsenal, the Safehouse probe. This is an instrument that doesn't just listen. It actively asks questions. It interrogates.
The architecture here is pretty straightforward. You take the observation layer from ccCalt, the part that tracks every item, and you fuse it with the execution engine from the AI Explorer. What you get is a single, unified instrument that can find a very specific item anywhere on the map, perform an action on it, and then precisely measure what the engine does in response.
This lets us run what we call stimulus injection missions. Here's how it works. The The probe targets an item that our observation layer is already tracking. It teleports right to it. Then it injects a stimulus. For example, it calls the set health function on that item and sets it to a ruined state. And because the bot is invisible to the CE, this whole experiment happens in a perfect clean room. The bot's presence doesn't contaminate the results. Then our observation layer sits back and records the outcome. We've gone from listening with a stethoscope to performing active surgery.
So that brings us to the final frontier, the really tough problem. How do you diagnose the kind of extreme server load that causes instability? You know, the desync and poor performance that's so hard to reproduce on demand, let alone analyze.
Well, first, our analysis has shown that something like 80 to 90% of what players call desync isn't really a network issue at its core. It's actually script-level frame time starvation. The server's script engine is just so overloaded it can't keep up. And guess what? We can simulate that. With the Safehouse probe, we can measure the script workload of one single player and then just turn the dial up. We can inject that same workload at a massive multiplier, effectively simulating the script stress of 60 players, but without needing 60 actual people.
But just simulating script load isn't the full picture. That's why we developed what we call the hybrid approach. We use the Safehouse probe to generate that massive artificial script load. But at the same time, we spin up a small fleet of automated headless clients, we call them burner accounts, that do nothing but connect and generate real, authentic network traffic. It's a dual-pronged attack. We stress the script engine and the network layer at the same time. It's the most accurate stress test you can possibly create.
And that brings everything full circle. The entire point of this whole arsenal, from the simplest tool to the most complex simulation, is to achieve one goal: to replace community folklore, to get rid of the guesswork and superstition, and replace it all with measured, verifiable, hard truth.
So let's just recap the whole arsenal. SeekHalt, that's our passive seismograph, just recording the natural tremors of the engine. The AI Explorer is our autonomous rover, mapping the world from inside a sterile cleanroom, where it can't be seen. The Safehouse probe, that's the scalpel and the syringe, allowing us to perform precise surgical interventions. And finally, the Phantom Player Sim is our centrifuge, spinning the whole system up to immense stress levels to see where it breaks.
Look, the DayZ engine is a black box, no doubt about it. But it isn't magic. It runs on cold, hard math and a set of rules. And what we've shown is that with the right arsenal of tools, you can force any system to reveal its underlying logic. You just have to know how to ask the right questions. So, the only question left for us is, what black box are we going to deconstruct next?
All right, let's get started. We're about to conduct an architectural audit of the DayZ modding ecosystem. We're going to be focusing on a really critical area: scripting and modding. The goal here is to dissect the very foundation that almost every modded server is built on. So here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to start with the fundamental mechanics, the physics of how this whole thing works. Then we'll look at the huge systemic risks that those mechanics create. And finally, we'll talk about a strategy for actually building resilient systems in this environment. Let's begin with the absolute basics, the override chain.
You see, to really understand the architecture, we first have to understand the machine itself, the physics that govern this entire environment. And that machine is the EnforceScript runtime.
This is the sandbox where every single mod operates, and its most critical feature is something called a modded class inheritance system. The logic is actually pretty simple, but it has some really profound consequences. It basically uses load order to decide which mod's code gets to run when there's a conflict. And here is the absolute crucial point. The last loaded mod gets the final word. It can either completely replace a function, or it can add its own logic and then call super to pass control down the chain to the next mod. But, and this is so important, a single missing super call anywhere in this chain silently cuts off all the logic that came before it. It just never gets to run.
So that little detail brings us directly to the engine's most dangerous, and what seems to be intentional design choice. It's how it handles competing mods, what we're going to call silent collisions.
Now, this isn't some hypothetical, what-if scenario. This is the single most common and most insidious source of errors on modded servers. And the reason it's so bad is because it's nearly impossible to diagnose. So look at this example. Mod A wants to change how stamina works. Mod B wants to change how player weight works. They both override the exact same function. If Mod B loads last, well, its weight logic runs perfectly.
But Mod A's stamina logic, it just vanishes. It's completely silently discarded by the engine. The operational consequence of this is what makes it so incredibly dangerous.
Right. There's no error message. There's nothing in the log files. There is zero indication at runtime that anything has gone wrong. The system is quite literally designed to fail silently. This turns diagnostics into a full-on forensic exercise. In a live environment, this means your stamina system might just stop working one day with absolutely no clue as to why. This is how you end up with deeply, deeply fragile servers.
And the scale of this problem is, well, it's huge. We're not talking about just 2 or 3 mods colliding here. On real production servers, we've measured override stacks on core game classes that are more than 16 layers deep. 16. A single missing line of code in that entire stack can cause a catastrophic yet completely silent system failure. So this flaw at the micro level, the silent collision, it builds up into a massive systemic risk at the macro level. So now we're going to zoom out and audit the framework layer to understand exactly how that happens.
Get this. Roughly 80% of all modded servers depend on something called the Community Framework, or CF. It's basically a foundational API that allows complex mods to interact with each other. But from an architectural point of view, this is a massive concentration of risk onto a single, non-essential component.
The framework that is holding up the majority of the ecosystem is essentially a dormant dependency. Development on it is frozen, it's been delisted from the Steam Workshop before, which is a major red flag, and while it's legally forkable, meaning someone could take it over, the reality is no viable community alternative has actually emerged. So what you have is a single point of failure that exists simply because of social inertia. So, if the community framework is a risk born from neglect, the second pillar of the modding ecosystem presents a much more rigid and frankly more dangerous category of risk. We call it the unforkable monopoly. We're talking about DayZ Expansion. You know, the mod that provides helicopters, advanced AI, quest systems, all that amazing stuff. Well, it operates under a very strict license. And the key term you need to focus on is no derivatives. So what does no derivatives mean? It means if you remix, transform, or build upon the material, you are not allowed to distribute your modified version. In plain English, it is legally unforkable. This means that if official development ever stops, the community has absolutely no legal path to take over maintenance. Unlike CF, which could be revived, DayZ Expansion's capabilities would just vanish from the ecosystem entirely.
Okay, so given these huge structural risks we've just identified, you absolutely need a dependency-aware design model just to survive. This brings us to what we call the Safe House Doctrine, a clear strategic alternative for mitigating all this risk. The standard approach that most people take is what we call the buy mindset. It is incredibly high risk. You just subscribe to heavy, monolithic mods based on the features they offer. You ignore the license implications, you inherit all the structural risk from these third parties, and you basically treat your mod list like a feature checklist.
In stark contrast, a much more resilient strategy is the fork and adapt mindset. With this approach, you prefer mods with permissive licenses, like MIT or GPL, things you are legally allowed to fork and maintain. You adapt the code in-house. You actively minimize your external dependencies. You're architecting for self-reliance and stability, treating the server as one integrated system, not just a collection of parts.
Okay, our audit is wrapping up. Let's go to our final summary of the architectural state of things.
So, the 2 central pillars of the entire DayZ modding ecosystem are single points of failure. The community framework is a SPOF by social neglect. A legal path to recovery exists, but no one is taking it. DayZ Expansion, on the other hand, is a SPOF by legal design. There is no community recovery path available at all. And this is the primary finding of our audit. A server's stability is only as strong as its deepest, most fragile dependency. Stability is not an accident. It is not a feature you can just subscribe to. It is an architectural property that has to be deliberately designed for, right from the very beginning.
And so the final question this audit leaves us with is one for you to answer. Reevaluate your own mod stack, but don't see it as just a list of features anymore. See it as an architectural dependency chain. Every single mod is a structural choice, and it has consequences for the stability of your entire world. So ask yourself, is your foundation built on stone, or is it just a stack of cards?
Let's be very clear. We're not here today to talk about opinions. We are conducting a structural audit of a system that is, frankly, in a state of cascading failure. This is a clinical examination of the DayZ modding architecture, a system defined by a profound and, as we'll see, an inherent fragility.
And this statement right here, this is the central thesis of our entire analysis. Every single mod you download, no matter how small or simple it seems, introduces a new vector for instability. To really understand why things break so spectacularly, we first have to understand exactly how they're built. So here's our game plan. We're going to dissect this in 5 distinct phases. We'll start with the fundamentals of how a single mod even works, and then we're going to build up, layer by layer, to the systemic chaos you see on a fully loaded server. Let's get started.
Okay, first things first. This is the most critical concept you have to grasp, because everything else builds on top of it. Mods in DayZ's engine and Fusion don't just add new stuff. They're not neatly packed little boxes of content. No, they fundamentally intercept and rewrite the core logic of the game itself.
The way this happens is through something called a modded class. Now, I want you to think of the original game code, the vanilla code, as a master blueprint. A mod author doesn't just create a new, separate blueprint. Instead, they effectively take a copy of that master blueprint and start drawing over it. By declaring their class as modded, they're telling the engine, hey, this isn't a new thing. This is a direct modification of something that already exists. The mod inherits everything from the original, but now it has the power to change any part of it.
And this is the core distinction, the fundamental misunderstanding most people have. People think mods are additive, like you're just adding a new rifle to a list of available rifles. The reality is an override model. When a mod wants to change, say, how stamina works, it doesn't just politely tweak a value. It literally jumps in front of the game's original stamina code and screams, ignore that guy, listen to me now. The original code isn't added to, it's completely hijacked.
So if that's what one mod does, what happens when 2 or 5 or 10 mods all try to override the exact same piece of game code? Well, it doesn't just throw a simple error and stop. Instead, the engine builds this precarious tower of code. Each mod gets stacked on top of the last one. We call this the execution chain. The engine handles these conflicts by just stacking them. The load order of your mods becomes absolutely critical. When a piece of code is run, the last mod that was loaded gets to speak first. If that mod is coded correctly, it contains a special command, super. That command says, okay, I'm done, pass control down to the next guy in line. And so it goes, down the chain, mod by mod, until it might, eventually, reach the original vanilla code at the very bottom. Each super call is just one fragile link holding that whole tower together. 16. Yes, on a live, running server, we have measured and confirmed an execution chain that is 16 layers deep. That is 16 different mods, all stacked on top of each other, all fighting for control over a single critical file, player base, the very code that governs your player character. Just try to imagine the sheer weight of that tower, all balancing on that one fragile chain of commands.
This unbelievably precarious structure leads us directly to the single most insidious failure pattern in this entire ecosystem. It's so dangerous, not because it causes a spectacular crash, but for the exact opposite reason. It fails in complete and utter silence.
So, let's ask the critical question. In that 16-layer tower we just described, what actually happens if 2 mods, say the one at layer 12 and the one down at layer 5, both try to change the very same function, like how your character calculates damage?
The integrity of that entire 16-layer system hinges on one single command, super. If the top mod, mod B, correctly calls super, execution passes down to the mod beneath it, mod A. The chain holds. But if the author of mod B simply forgets to include that one little call, the chain is broken, instantly. Mod A's code is never run. It's not that it fails, it's that it's completely and silently discarded by the engine as if it never existed.
And this is the part you really need to let sink in. This isn't a bug. The server doesn't crash, there are no script errors, no warnings are written to any log file. The system provides absolutely zero indication that a vital piece of game logic, maybe it was an anti-cheat check, maybe it was a core function for a medical mod, has just been erased from reality. It just vanishes.
Now these individual silent failures, they accumulate, and they lead to a much bigger systemic problem. The entire modding scene has become overwhelmingly reliant on just a handful of massive framework mods. And this creates a huge shared risk for thousands upon thousands of servers.
To analyze this properly, you have to approach it with a specific mindset. We call it the dependency-aware design model. It sounds technical, but it's a simple idea. It just means you look at your entire mod list before you go live, and you ask the hard questions. Where are the weak links? What depends on what? And what is the blast radius if one of these critical mods fails?
And when you do that analysis, the data is, well, it's unequivocal. Our research shows that approximately 80%, 80, of all modded DayZ servers are built on the exact same small collection of foundational mods. This is a staggering concentration of risk. A single failure in one of these frameworks doesn't just break one server, it has the potential to cripple the vast majority of the entire modded ecosystem. Let's look at some concrete examples from the single point of failure register. The community framework, CF, which so many mods depend on, it's a high risk because its development is effectively frozen. What about nearly all helicopters and boats? They come from DayZ expansion. That's a critical risk because its license strictly forbids anyone else from picking it up and maintaining it if the original developers walk away. And then you've got entire categories of essential tools that are maintained by a single person. That is a massive personnel risk. The foundation itself is brittle.
And finally, let's connect all of this architectural fragility to the one thing every player actually feels: server performance. Because this isn't some random, unpredictable lag. It is the mathematical, inevitable consequence of this design. The entire performance bottleneck comes down to one single, unchangeable limitation in the game's engine. All of that scripted logic, every function call from every mod for every player for every zombie has to get in a single file line. It is all executed on one CPU thread. You can't just throw more hardware at it. You can't run things in parallel to speed it up.
This single-threaded reality leads to a truly punishing cost equation. For every tick, the server calculates updates for everything. The cost of that calculation is then multiplied by the depth of your mod stack. So every single mod you add to that 16-layer player-based stack doesn't just add its own small cost, it multiplies the processing cost for every single player and entity on the server. The impact, as you can see, is not a straight line. It's not linear, it is multiplicative. Adding 5 mods creates a significant performance cost, but once you get to 15 or more, you see an extreme processing load that starts to completely overwhelm that single thread's ability to get its work done in time.
And here it is, the tangible result. The immense script overhead from these deep mod stacks crushes the server's tick rate. When the tick rate drops too low, the server literally starts skipping physics frames just to try and keep up. The server's simulation of the world and your client's simulation of the world fall out of sync. This is the root cause. This is why cars kill players. It is a direct, physical consequence of architectural decay.
The conclusion, then, is unavoidable. The stability of any modded server is not determined by its best feature or its most powerful hardware. It is dictated entirely by its deepest, most convoluted, and most fragile chain of dependencies. It is quite literally a house of cards, and a single broken link can bring the entire structure down in total silence.
All right, today we're conducting what is essentially a post-mortem. The subject of our analysis is a critical system failure, a phenomenon that we call the performance death spiral. Our approach here is going to be clinical, it's going to be precise, and it's based entirely on the system's architecture. So here's how we're going to break this down. We'll conduct a systematic diagnosis in 6 phases. First, we'll define the hard limits of the system. Then we'll pinpoint the exact point of failure. After that, we'll model the factors that cause the strain, quantify the collapse with an actual equation, trace the domino effect that follows, and finally land on our conclusion. You know, to really understand why a system like this collapses, you first have to understand the clock it runs on. This is the fundamental unit of time, the very heartbeat that governs every single thing that happens in the simulation world. Okay, right off the bat, let's get one thing crystal clear. When we talk about server FPS, we are not talking about how smooth the game looks on your screen. That's visual frame rate. We're talking about simulation throughput. How many times per second the server can process the entire state of the world. Think of it as the server's pulse. Now, the engine's physics simulation, the core of how things move and interact, is designed to run at a very specific, fixed rate, 40 frames per second. This is the target. This is the number that the whole system is trying to hit, constantly. So here's where it gets critical. Basic math gives us our hard limit. If you take 1,000 milliseconds in a second and divide it by that target of 40 frames, you get 25 milliseconds.
That isn't a suggestion. That is the entire non-negotiable processing window. The server gets to do everything: calculate physics, run AI, process player actions, and execute every single line of mod code before the next cycle has to start. It's an absolute budget.
All right, so we have our 25 millisecond time budget. The next logical step is to find the biggest constraint on how that budget gets spent. We need to locate the system's inherent architectural bottleneck.
And we need to bust a pretty common myth right now. You've probably heard that the DayZ server only uses a single CPU core. That is just plain wrong. The server process is absolutely multi-threaded, and it uses multiple cores for very specific, very heavy tasks.
This table shows the situation perfectly. On the left, you see the heavy lifting engine tasks: physics, networking, animations. These get spread out across multiple cores. But, and this is the most important part of this whole analysis, look to the right. All the gameplay logic, every mod you add, every AI decision, every bit of damage, it all gets funneled through the EnforceScript virtual machine. And that is strictly single-threaded. It's one single lane of traffic. Everything has to get in line and wait its turn.
And look, this isn't just a hunch. It's a documented constraint that goes way back in this engine's DNA. A developer for the engine family that DayZ comes from said it plainly. Because scripts can touch literally anything at any time, you simply cannot run them in parallel. It would be chaos. This single thread is the system's ultimate point of failure. So, how do we actually measure the load on this one critical bottleneck? Well, for that, we use an analytical model. It breaks the total server load down into 5 distinct categories. This is what lets us stop guessing about performance and start actually predicting it. These are the 5 things all fighting for a piece of that 25 millisecond budget. You've got script cost, which is simply how long your mods take to execute. Simulation cost is the price you pay for all the things your mods add to the world. Then you have the cost of the loot economy, the cost of the map itself, and finally, the overhead that comes with every single player who connects. Now, it is absolutely critical to understand that every mod has 2 different kinds of cost. For example, a really simple mod that just spawns a ton of AI might have almost 0 script cost, but its simulation cost, all those AI entities needing physics and pathfinding, can be massive. On the flip side, a complex UI mod might have a very high script cost, but add no simulation cost to the world at all. You have to analyze both.
Okay, all of this brings us to the core formula. Because bad performance isn't random. It's a mathematical outcome. We can actually write an equation that shows us the exact moment the system will collapse.
And there it is. The total processing time on that single thread is the product of 3 things: the number of active objects in the world, times the number of updates they demand every frame, all of that multiplied by the depth of your mod stack. Let's break that down real quick. Active entity count is just all the stuff: players, AI, cars, items, anything being simulated. Frame callbacks are how often those things need attention from the script thread. But the real killer, the force multiplier, is the mod stock depth. If you have 7 different mods that all want to change the same function on the player, the server has to run all 7 of those functions, one after the other, for every player, every single tick. It multiplies the cost incredibly fast.
Which, of course, leads to the big question. What happens when the result of that equation, the time it takes to process one tick, is bigger than the 25 milliseconds you have in the budget?
Well, what happens is a failure cascade. It isn't a gentle slowdown. It's a synchronized, system-wide collapse as the server desperately tries and fails to keep up with a timeline it can no longer maintain.
The first thing to give out is physics. The server starts skipping calculations to try and catch up. This immediately leads to vehicle prediction failing on the client, which is why you see cars glitch out and car deaths. Next, AI updates get delayed, causing them to stutter and teleport. Then the loot economy slows to a crawl. And finally, the whole simulation just becomes unreliable. You get action delays, hits don't register, and players desync.
And this right here connects the dots perfectly. Those common complaints you hear from players, they are direct, observable symptoms of this cascade. My car just flew into a tree. That's physics desync, because the server skipped frames. The zombies are teleporting. That's the AI update being delayed. I shot him but got no hit marker. That's the script thread, still choking on the last overloaded tick and just not getting to your action in time. So what's the big takeaway from this whole diagnostic? It's that we have to fundamentally shift how we think about and approach server performance. Bad server performance isn't just bad luck. It's not some mysterious thing that just happens. It is the predictable, mathematical result of exceeding the system's clearly defined execution budget.
And that means this isn't an unsolvable problem. It's an engineering challenge, but one with defined limits. The entire goal of an analysis like this is to map those limits. Because once you can actually measure your execution budget, you can finally start designing a world that works within it. Today, we are opening a case file on what can only be called an epidemic in the DayZ community: server administration by rumor. We're talking about thousands of game worlds that people pour countless hours into, being managed based on whispers and folklore instead of objective fact. The Safehouse project exists for one reason: to replace that guesswork with hard, instrument-tested truth. And in this analysis, you're going to see exactly how that's done. This right here is the guiding principle for everything we do. It's an absolutely uncompromising, evidence-first standard. Any piece of folklore, a story you heard on Discord, a tip from an ancient wiki, we treat it as a hypothesis. It's a question that needs an answer. It is never the answer itself. Before any claim becomes canon in the DayZ World Atlas, it has to be proven against the engine. And today, we're going to apply that standard to some of the most stubborn myths out there. So, here's our agenda for this forensic audit. First, we'll define the problem itself. Then, we're going to systematically dismantle 3 of the most damaging myths about how servers work. After that, we'll dig into the why this misinformation is so sticky, by introducing a concept called the proto-boundary. And we'll finish with the only real way forward: the mandate to measure.
Look, you really can't overstate the scale of this problem. Thousands of people who run servers are setting up their worlds based on things they heard in a chat room or from wikis that haven't been updated in years. And the fallout is real. It leads to hours and hours of wasted time, it breaks game mechanics, and in the worst cases, entire communities get their progress wiped for literally no good technical reason. It's an epidemic of bad information.
And the reason this folklore hangs around? It's because well over 90% of DayZ's most important systems, especially the central economy loop that controls every single item, they all operate behind this wall of compiled code. Server admins can't see it. They can't read the logic. They are, for all intents and purposes, trying to configure a black box. And that vacuum of real knowledge is what allows folklore to rush in and take over.
So let's be crystal clear on what we mean by folklore. We're talking about these widely held community beliefs about how the game works. They get passed down from person to person, but they've never actually been checked against the facts. They haven't been verified with primary evidence, things like the actual source code or direct instrumented testing. Our job today is to take a few of these beliefs and move them out of the folklore column and firmly into fact or fiction.
We're going to start with the biggest, most widespread, and you could argue the most damaging myth in DayZ's server admin history. This is the belief in the selective wipe. It's this beautiful idea that you, as an admin, can reset all the loot in the world but magically leave all your players' hard-earned bases standing. The specific advice you'll see everywhere, every single day in support channels goes like this: hey, to refresh your server's loot, just delete the types.bin file. The promise is that this one simple action will scrub all the junk on the ground, but somehow know to leave tents and barrels and walls alone. It sounds like the perfect solution, right? Simple, elegant, and completely fundamentally wrong. All right, to understand why it's wrong, you have to look at how the server actually stores its data. This table breaks it down. Now, pay close attention to the column on the right. You see the dynamic files, vehicles.bin, players.db. They all store entity state. That's the actual living record of what exists in your world. But types.bin, that's completely different. It is a configuration cache. Think of it as a compiled, fast-loading copy of your types.xml settings. It's the server's rulebook, not the actual game state. And here it is. This is the smoking gun. In DayZ's central economy, that can of beans on the ground and that giant player-built watchtower are treated as the same kind of thing. They both fall under the dynamic category, which means they are both saved in the exact same files, the dynamic_.bin files. There is zero file-level separation between ground loot and player bases in the vanilla game architecture. They are all stored together in one big pool of data. So the bottom line, the engine reality, is this: deleting types.bin removes exactly 0 items from the world. 0. All it does is force the server to take a few extra seconds on the next startup to reread your types XML and rebuild that cache file. The actual state of the world remains completely untouched. The belief that you can perform a selective wipe this way is, by the Atlas evidence standard, officially contradicted.
Okay, so we've put the selective wipe myth to bed. Let's move on to the next one. The idea that you have to wipe your server every time there's a big game update. It's a common practice, but is it actually necessary? The big fear here is that a new version of DayZ won't be able to properly read the old character data from the players.db file. The worry is that this will cause massive corruption, break everyone's characters, and just generally destabilize the whole server. And it's this fear that leads so many server owners to wipe away months of their community's progress, thinking they have no other option. But here's the thing. The engine was literally built to handle this. It has a forward compatibility system built right in. When the game loads a character from the database, the first thing it does is check the version number on that save data. If it sees the save is from an older patch, say before version 1.16, it knows that certain new data fields, like maybe a broken leg state, won't be there. So it just skips trying to read them and initializes them with safe default values. The process is designed to be robust and fail-safe. The engine reality is that wipes are a choice, not a mandate. Now, they can be a perfectly fine choice for gameplay reasons. Maybe you want to reset the economy, give everyone a fresh start, start a new season. But that is an operator choice for community pacing. It is not a technical requirement to prevent things from breaking. The engine is designed to handle these version updates just fine. So the belief that wipes are mandatory? Contradicted. All right, for our third and final myth, we're going to tackle something every player and admin has nightmares about: a server crash. And there's a very specific piece of folklore that has grown up around what happens next, a belief known as the 15-minute rule. This belief is incredibly specific and repeated with absolute certainty all over the community. It says that when a DayZ server crashes, the world state is rolled back by a fixed, predictable period of exactly 15 minutes. People state this number like it's a fundamental constant of the universe. It isn't. And here's where the confusion comes from. People are mixing up two completely separate systems. First, you have the DayZ engine's own internal save system. It's constantly saving the world's state in segments, completing a full cycle roughly every 2 minutes. This is hard-coded into the engine. You can't change it. Then you have a totally different thing, the automated backup service that your hosting provider offers. That system is often set to run every 15 or 30 minutes by default. The 15-minute number comes from the host's backup tool, not from the game itself. So the engine reality is that the actual data loss from a crash is variable, and it's much, much shorter than 15 minutes. The rollback window is tied directly to the engine's own internal safe cycle, which is about 2 minutes long. Depending on when the crash happened within that cycle, you might lose a few seconds of progress, or just under 2 minutes, but it is never a fixed 15. The myth comes from confusing a hosting feature with an engine mechanic, and for that reason, it is contradicted. So we've just taken apart 3 of the most foundational myths in server administration, using clear, verifiable evidence. And that brings up a much bigger question, doesn't it? Why do these myths hang around? Why, when the evidence is right there, does the folklore continue to be the dominant narrative? Well, the answer lies in a fundamental concept of DayZ's architecture. The answer is something we call the proto-boundary. You can think of it like a solid wall that separates the things a server admin can see and touch, their config files, from the hidden inner workings of the game engine, where all the real logic actually happens. To be more specific, the proto-boundary is the line between the game's scripting language, InforScript, and the compiled C++ code of the core and Fusion engine. This is that black box we were talking about earlier. All the really critical systems, the central economy, the persistence scheduler, all of it lives on the other side of that boundary. We can't read the code. We can only observe what goes in and measure what comes out. This table gives you some really clear examples. On the left is what you, the admin, can see. You can edit types.xml to say, I want 50 of this item. But on the right, behind the boundary, is the complex evaluation loop that actually decides if, when, and where to spawn one. You can see that the players.db file exists, but you have no visibility into the engine's internal triggers that decide the exact moment to save a character. Your config files are just inputs you feed into the black box. And all of this leads us to our final, and frankly our most important conclusion. If the engine's core logic is a black box, if we are denied the ability to simply read the code to find the truth, then we are left with only one valid method for understanding it. We are left with what we call the mandate to measure. Reading the XML is not enough. Trying to guess what's happening based on those files is exactly how folklore is born.
To truly understand how the DAISY engine works, you have to treat it like a scientific subject. You must build instruments, custom software, diagnostic tools, in-game probes like our AI Explorer to measure its behavior directly. You must generate hard, empirical data from inside the engine itself. This is the only way to replace folklore with fact. It is the mission of the Safe House Project, because the only truth is the one that can be measured.